everybody. I wanted to spend a little bit of time going over what recrystallization is, that process that purifies solids. And this video is going to help you right along. So let's get started. So we'll jump right into talking about what recrystallization is. And like I just said a few seconds ago, recrystallization is a process used to purify solids. Okay, so when you talk about solids, we're talking about things found in the solid state, and usually we're talking about crystal solids, or solids that have some sort of crystal structure. Usually we can't recrystallize things like glass and jello and stuff like that. The other thing is we want to contrast this to distillation, the lab that we just finished. Distillation is purely for purifying liquid mixtures. This is purely for purifying solids. Now, recrystallization will only work if you have two things. First of all, you need a relatively small amount of contaminant, meaning if you have solids which are 50% junk and 50% compound, sometimes that won't work. So you'll want something that is relatively pure, meaning something on the order of 80 or 90% of the compound that you want and 10 to 20% of contaminant or less. The more junk you have in it, the less effective a recrystallization is. The other thing that you have to do, which is can be tricky when you're not doing one of these that are canned like in a lab, is you have to find an appropriate solvent. And an appropriate solvent is one that is where the solid doesn't dissolve at room temperature. Okay, so the solid, when the liquid is, or the solvent is at room temperature, it doesn't dissolve. Okay, so RT is room temperature. And that when you heat it up, the solid will dissolve when it's warm. Okay, so that way you're taking advantage of the solubility rule, and that plays into this point right here. As you heat a liquid up, that liquid can hold more solid. Okay, so that's a general solubility trend, that the warmer a liquid is, the more solid that can be dissolved in it. Hot coffee can hold more sugar than cold coffee. Hot tea can hold more sugar than room temperature or iced tea. And so that's the thing that you're talking about. And usually, because of this, what we want to do is keep everything warm, because we want to have the solid dissolve while it's warm, and then when we cool it down, because it won't dissolve when it's room temperature, as it gets cooler, the crystals of the desired solid will dissolve, or will crystallize out of the solution. Okay, so it's all about that heating and cooling cycle. So a lot of times you want to keep things warm. Not all the time. You can do this. There are methods where you can add a second solvent, and that second solvent changes the solubility of the recrystallizing solvent, and so that can do that. There's one of those in the lab. But the whole idea is that you want something that dissolves when it's warm or at some point, and doesn't dissolve when it's cool or at a different level in the mixture. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of ways that we can do this process. Okay, so here's the recrystallization apparatus. This is the first part of recrystallizing. And so what you're going to have in here is, this is an Erlenmeyer flask. Despite what it looks like, it is not corked. You don't ever want to heat a closed system. That's a good way to make a bomb. So in here would be the solid that you are trying to dissolve. Okay, and you need the hot plate to keep this nice and hot here, so that it will all dissolve. Okay, so here's the kind of the chemistry behind it. Okay, when you added this stuff, the solid, there was also a few impurities, which I've marked in blue. So the hope is that everything will dissolve in the solution that you picked. Okay, and so when it all dissolves, until it just barely dissolves when it's warm, everything should be dissolved in the liquid. And then you're going to take this off of the hot plate, and then you're going to cool it down to room temperature, and then in an ice bath. And as we said before, think about this, when that Erlenmeyer flask gets cool finally, okay, and you have your liquid in here, the solid, the contaminant, is still going to be in the solution, but as it cools, your red solid that you want to crystallize will crystallize at the bottom, because this is the thing that we want to try to purify. So that's why it won't work if there's too much impurities, because that will recrystallize as well with your desired crystals, and we don't want that. So you want to make sure that you cool this off, and you cool this off nice and slowly. That's also part of the process, because you want the recrystallization to happen very, very slowly and kind of very genuinely. So you put it off, and then you put it in onto room temperature, and you let everything cool to room temperature, and then you put it into an ice bath. Let me get ice cubes out here. Okay, you put it into ice cubes, and then you cool it down even more, and that's going to help your percent recovery of your solid. Okay, and then hopefully you hope to get almost as much solid out of it as you put into it. Okay, because again, remember, you don't have a ton of impurity in your liquid or in your solid. Okay, the other thing you do is you want to filter this, because if we go back, you have the solid, but you also have the liquid in there, so you need to separate the two. Well, the way to separate a solid from a liquid is by filtering. You use a filtering apparatus. So this is a vacuum filtering apparatus. You can see we have a vacuum pump. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the liquid that we had in your Erlenmeyer flask. I can't draw Erlenmeyer flask. And so that liquid is going to be dumped here, and inside that liquid will be your solid. Okay? The liquid will pass through the Buchner funnel. That's a special funnel designed to do vacuum filtration here. And the liquid will end up being down here, that solvent with all your impurities. And then up here on the Buchner funnel will be the purified product with on a piece of filter paper. And so now everything is filtered, and you have your solid separated from your liquid. Now the reason why we hook it up to a vacuum is to create suction. That suction will help pull the liquid down through here, and the other thing that it will do is help pull air through the solid, and that is going to help dry the solid and get rid of any remaining solvent that's in the solid, and that'll pull it down through here. Okay, even though we take this and we do we have the filter paper with all the solid on there, and we do the vacuum, we still need to take that filter paper and we need to let it air dry. So you'll put that on you'll put that filter paper on a watch glass and let it air dry over some amount of time. And then eventually air drying will cause those crystals to form and will be dry, and then you're ready to do melting point to test how good your recrystallization was. Okay, so here's the expectations. Okay, one thing that you usually get, because you have to use some solid that is going to be a crystalline solid, you can't use things that are what we call amorphous or doesn't have some sort of regular crystal structure. You're going to get these beautiful crystals. Okay, so beautiful, I know, is in the eye of the beholder, but you start with a pile of something and you get long greenish needle-like crystals, or you get these flat, flaky, like purpley, shiny crystals. Okay, I mean, typically when your product or the thing that you end up with will look remarkably different than the thing that you started with, and they will typically be nice and beautiful crystals as opposed to this gloppy, gooey mess. Okay, and again, because you're dealing with a solid that has not a lot of contaminant in it, you should have a relatively high recovery. In this case, instead of using the word percent yield, which is what we use in when we do reactions, we're going to call it recovery. So our percent recovery should be high. Okay, the percent recovery should be really high in this, because you're starting with something that is already 80 or 90 or higher percent purity. So if you get something low in terms of recovery, that means that there's other things that have happened, like you lost some of your solid in the solution. It didn't crystallize fully. Maybe when you filtered it, some went through it got lodged in the filter pit. There's lots of reasons. Okay, and the other thing is that when we test this, the melting point, MP stands for melting point, should be really close to the literature value. Okay, because again, remember, we started with something that was relatively pure and we made it even more pure. So the melting point should be close to whatever value you're going to look up to compare this to. Okay, so that is recrystallization and what you should expect and kind of how the process works. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and have a great day, everybody.